Hi everyone, Jonathan Hall here. This video is the first of 5 sessions that I've recorded for an online course I've done called Ship Better Code Faster. In this first video, it's really just an introduction to, of course, the course, but more broadly, it's an introduction to the concept of DevOps and what DevOps entails and what's included in sort of that framework or that mindset. I really hope you find it valuable and interesting. If you have any questions, I'd love to hear. Please leave a comment below. Feel free to subscribe. And if you find the video educational, please like it. If you would like to see the full course, it's a paid course, but I'll have a link to that, of course, in the description below as well. Please enjoy. All right, I think it's the top of the hour, so we can go ahead and get started. Thanks everybody for joining. This course will cover a lot of information. I don't expect anybody to fully absorb everything I say, and that's perfectly all right. I hope that from each session you can get at least 1 or 2 things that are valuable to you. So that's kind of my goal. I'm gonna go, in 1 hour, I can't go into the depth that I would like to on any of these topics. So this is kind of a top level view of a lot of information. There's also a lot of information I will not touch on at all regarding DevOps and coding practices. If you're interested, of course, I do have other information available on some of these topics. Some of the information I'm presenting, I have presented elsewhere, on my blog, on other YouTube videos, for example. Just send me a question. Let me know what you want to know about, and I'm happy to try to point you in that direction. So just a little bit about myself. My name is Jonathan. I live near Amsterdam, although you can probably tell from my accent that I'm not Dutch. I grew up in the Midwest United States. I've been in the Netherlands about 6 years. And I love it, except this week when we have a lot of snow. I thought I escaped some of that, but better luck next time I move across the world. So I focus most of my attention in my consulting practice is related to helping small teams get the most out of DevOps. And what I really mean by that is, I think we hear a lot from big companies, Google, Netflix, Amazon, about all the big, exciting, sexy things they're doing in DevOps. Maybe it's a little bit discouraging if you're on a team of 2 or 3 or 5 people, or maybe maybe you're in a startup and you don't have all the resources to do Chaos Monkey and stuff. I try to focus on helping these smaller teams and smaller companies get some of the advantages that DevOps can offer. So that's kind of how I focus. Of course, this course is designed for anybody who's interested in learning more about DevOps practices. So I want to tell you a little story. A story about my introduction into the world of DevOps. It was back in 2006. I had just started a new job. I started as a network engineer for a small company that did spam filtering. And it was just, I think I'd been there a month when over Thanksgiving Day weekend, our single developer, who wasn't me, he pushed a single update out to our 150 or so customers, and it broke every single customer. Every single customer's email stopped sending. All of our customers, their email stopped working. They started calling us, you can imagine. We were a small company. I think we had 3 technical staff, myself, a developer, and a technical support representative. And then we had our other staff in other departments. Over that weekend, every single person, including the janitor, was taking phone calls from our customers about this broken system. So, of course, we had to investigate to see what was wrong with the system. And ultimately, we discovered it was smaller than a 1-character fix. It was a 1-bit fix. We had a permission bit incorrectly set on a file, on a script. So we had to log in. We had to literally log into every customer's machine to fix this, to do a chmod command on this script to fix it. Um, it took us about 3 or 4 days to get everybody fixed. In most cases, we were able to log in remotely over SSH and fix it. In a few cases where the customers were behind firewalls, we had to walk somebody through the process of fixing it over the phone, manually telling them, here's how you log into the root account, here's how you do the correct command, and so on. It was a big fiasco. Ever since then, this so-called Black Friday incident has kind of set me on a mission to better understand and reduce or eliminate system failures like this one. And so that's really, in my view, that's kind of what brought me to the idea of DevOps and what I want to talk to you about today. So let's talk briefly about the overview of this course. So this is a 5-day long course. Today I'm going to talk mostly about what is DevOps and how it relates to Agile and a few other things. Tomorrow, session 2 is about continuous improvement, which in my view is maybe the most fundamental part of DevOps or even Agile. Session 3, we'll talk about continuous integration, which is what a lot of people think about, of course, when they think about DevOps. So I'm going to talk about what continuous integration is and possibly surprise you a little bit with my definition of continuous integration. We'll see. Then session 4, automated validation, or another part. Automated testing is another part that's commonly associated with DevOps, so we'll talk about that too. And then finally, on session 5 on Friday, I'm going to talk about the idea that you never work alone, even when you do work alone. I'll explain that on Friday. Stay tuned for the explanation there. Okay, so I want to do a poll. I'm just curious to know who my audience is. That can help me tailor this a little bit. So it looks like there's still a few more responses coming in, but it looks like we have mostly backend developers, which is great. Second poll, let me make this one visible. How long have you been working in software development? And this could be in any capacity. It doesn't have to be that you've been in your current role this long. Looks like we have a fairly experienced group here. I see most of you have at least 3 years. Some of you as many as 10 or more years. So that's really good. So today, I'm going to just do a brief overview of what I'm talking about specifically today. I'm going to talk about what is DevOps. I'm going to start with a description of what DevOps isn't, address some common misconceptions, and then I'm going to define DevOps. And I'm going to go through the primary DevOps practices and how they apply to the software development process. And I want to compare DevOps to Agile. These are two confusing terms, and when you try to compare them, it gets even more confusing for many people. So that's kind of the goal here. So let's get started. What is DevOps? Now, this I would love to hear your thoughts in chat, just briefly, in a sentence or so. To you, what does DevOps mean? I'm going to read back some of the answers for the sake of the recording. Developers having a role in pushing code to production. I like that. Containerizing my app, pushing it to Docker Hub, pulling it to Kubernetes and running it there, and all the in-between details. Good. DevOps is systematizing the SDLC. I have to Google what SDLC stands for. Software development lifecycle, of course, that makes sense. Okay, so DevOps is systematizing the software development lifecycle. Configuration management. It's a culture. That's a nice short answer. Communication, but that's because I read your email. Oh, well, thanks for reading my email. Automation, CI/CD, automatization. Great. Those are good answers. I'm going to talk briefly about what DevOps isn't. And fortunately, I haven't seen anybody here say any of these like terrible misconceptions. So that's good. But I think it's good to get these out of the way anyway. So, set of tools. DevOps is not a set of tools. DevOps, like art, is a mindset. Somebody mentioned something similar in the chat. DevOps practitioners, like artists, use tools, but you wouldn't say that a tool is the art, so I wouldn't say that the tool is the DevOps. And the tools don't make DevOps or the artist. I'm reminded of a story I heard. I used to do amateur photography, and a friend of mine told me this story. about a woman who went to an art show, a photography show, and she saw some beautiful photographs. She just loved them so much. She went up and spoke to the photographer and said, "I love your photos. They're great. Could I have you over for dinner?" And the photographer graciously agreed. They went to he went over to her house for dinner. They had a great dinner. And during dinner, the woman said to him, "Your photos are so beautiful. You must have a really expensive camera." And his response was, "Your dinner was so delicious. You must have really expensive cookware." Further, specialists. Some people have the idea that DevOps is means that nobody has a specialty, that everybody does everything. That's not true. DevOps doesn't make all devs and ops equal in role or skill. There's still room for dedicated developers and dedicated operations people. DevOps just means that devs and ops work together and not separately. There's a concept of silos or throwing things over the fence to the next team. That's the idea, is to get rid of that in DevOps. DevOps also doesn't mean there aren't any rules. I've spoken to people who think that, we use DevOps so there aren't any rules. Everybody can have root on production servers or something like that. That's not what DevOps means. It doesn't mean free for all the devs to go do whatever they want in production. In fact, it may well mean more rules. But with extra rules, you get additional consistency and the option for greater automation and so on. So, I like to say that the proper rules provide additional freedom because you don't have to worry about checking what you're doing all the time. If you don't have to worry about things, you have more freedom to do what matters. A job title. This is my favorite one. So many people say things like, "I'm a DevOps engineer," or you see recruitment links on LinkedIn all the time. Hiring for senior DevOps engineer. A DevOps engineer, in my view, is an oxymoron. It doesn't make sense. DevOps is a mindset, not a role, and it's about cooperation. I mean, if you replace the word DevOps with the word cooperation, and it makes sense, then you're doing well. If it doesn't make sense, then you don't understand DevOps. And nobody would ever say, "I'm a senior cooperation engineer," or "I work on the cooperation team." When you put DevOps into a title, if you say there's a group of DevOps engineers over there, that puts it back into the silo, and that's the whole point of DevOps, is to get rid of those silos. If the DevOps guys take care of it, if that's your attitude or the attitude of somebody on your team, then they don't understand DevOps. And further, whenever somebody says DevOps engineer, what they really mean, in my view, in my experience, is ops engineer. If that's the case, just say ops engineer. I don't know why you would put dev in front of it. When you look at we're going to talk more about this chart in a moment, but when you look at this chart, the different stages of DevOps, the roles that fall to the DevOps engineer typically are release configuration and monitoring, which are just operations. So don't call it DevOps anymore. Just call it ops, as I said on the last slide. So I prefer the term operations engineer, as I just mentioned, or sometimes site reliability engineer. It's slightly different, but similar. And then finally, DevOps is not agile. That might be a little bit contentious. I'm going to explain. Simply doing DevOps will not make you agile. In fact, it could be argued that DevOps can actually work in a traditional waterfall project. You just maybe have if you follow the 7 stages of DevOps in a waterfall fashion, you're doing DevOps potentially in a waterfall fashion. I would, however, argue that doing DevOps, whether you call it that or not, but doing the practices of DevOps is essential for proper agile software development. So now that I've told you everything that I think DevOps is not, let's talk about some things that it actually is. Brief history of DevOps. Not going to spend a lot of time on this slide here, but it was the term is only 12 years old. Well, not even. It was coined back in 2009 by Patrick Dubois in Belgium at the first DevOps days. It's really a culmination of many older concepts, including Agile and Scrum and several other things. It's related closely to Kaizen, Lean, Kanban, all these other technologies and methodologies that have come out of manufacturing and software development. And the definition is fuzzy and seems to constantly be changing, which makes this part of the presentation difficult because I'm trying to define it. Wikipedia tells us DevOps combines software development, dev, and IT operations, ops, to shorten the development lifecycle and provide continuous delivery and high quality. It's maybe useful. It's maybe not the most useful, though. One definition I use sometimes is DevOps is the intentional culture of fusing disciplines to improve business value. And that's kind of a bunch of big fancy buzzwords. An easier way maybe is to say that DevOps, as I said before, DevOps is cooperation. Cooperation between devs and ops. So let's talk about some of the nitty gritty here. I want to talk about, here's that chart again. I want to talk about the different stages or phases. I don't know the best word for these segments of this chart, but the different, we'll call them stages of the DevOps lifecycle. So I'm going to start with plan, and we'll just go through the little circle here, the loop. So of course in DevOps, or in software development, one of the first things you need to do is to plan what to develop. This is often done through user stories. It could be through bug trackers, whatever. You put those things into a backlog. You do some sort of prioritization, and then you probably delegate those to somebody, depending on the size of your team. Maybe you're on a solo project, so you just delegate to yourself. If you're on a larger team with a product owner or a product manager or something, someone's going to be delegated to pick up that task. Something to note, this is something that is largely handled by, for example, Scrum. I think I'll talk about this a little bit more later, but this is almost the only part of DevOps that is head-on addressed by Scrum. So I spoke to a lot of Scrum practitioners who think Scrum is the bee's knees and they don't need DevOps because Scrum handles it all. In my view, that's not true. Scrum and DevOps work very well together, but they are not the same thing. The next step is create. This is the part most of us developers are most comfortable with. This is where we write the code. This is where you have fun or maybe scary, depending on your view, practices like extreme programming, if you're familiar with that, things like pair programming, TDD. And this, of course, is where you apply all the great tools you learned in school and in reading, the solid practices, solid principles, best practices. This is where you do your dry and your wet and all that fun stuff that you talked about on Stack Overflow and at meetups. All that the sort of nitty gritty of coding. That's what happens in this stage. It doesn't only apply to coding, though. Of course, if you are a, say, graphics designer on a web app team, then this is also where you're creating your artwork or your layouts or your CSS or videos. The next stage is verification. We're also pretty good at this, at least to some extent, in the software development mindset, I think. This is where code review comes in, of course. Continuous integration. I told you a moment ago I'm gonna challenge potentially your view on what continuous integration is. Here I mean simply automated tests that happen every time you push code into your repository. This can involve static analysis and linters. I'm going to talk in great detail about that later. And this could also, of course, include manual testing. It could be going to a QA team. It could be user testing. You could, literally sit down with users from around the world and ask them to use your software and give you feedback. Any sort of verification, of course, can happen in this stage. Packaging. Let me step back a second there. You don't typically do end user verification before you package. So the order here isn't strict. Just keep that in mind. Some of these things may happen slightly out of order. So packaging, this is the idea of building a zip file or an APK or a Docker image or something that gets shipped. So this is something that developers sometimes are familiar with. It probably depends a lot on what part of the stack you work in. You may or may not have a lot of familiarity with this. And then release. Sometimes this gets kind of just muddled in. It goes back to the concept that the order isn't strict on these things. Continuous deployment or continuous delivery, the actual releasing or maybe installation of your software, depending on the kind of software you do. This could be done in any number of ways on Kubernetes, Heroku. You could even ship floppy disks if you have customers who want floppy disks. Doesn't really matter. There's 1,000 ways to ship and release software. Generally after releasing your software is the configuration step. Again, depending on the type of software, if you're installing on a server or a mobile device or shipping physical media to your customers, this happens in different ways and by different people, but it happens. For server-based software, you're often going to see this done with some sort of automation tools like Puppet or Ansible or Kubernetes. Sometime after that, generally comes monitoring. Monitoring is a topic I'm not going to get into much detail on in this course. As I mentioned at the beginning, there's just too much to cover in 5 days. But this is definitely part of DevOps, and you would do well to pick it up. And that brings us back to planning. You take the output of these various things, monitoring in particular, you discover that there's a bug or there's a failure, and that becomes the input for the next planning session. What's missing? I covered all of the steps, all of the stages of on the chart. Maybe I can bounce back to that chart here. So we've covered all of these, but there's something missing, and I won't keep you in suspense too much longer. What's missing is the concept of continuous improvement, which is kind of implicit in that chart. The infinity symbol, the idea that things feed back into each other. And in my view, this is actually the most important part of Agile or DevOps. Scrum has has the retrospectives. There's postmortems. Just a culture of learning. There's so many different ways that you can work on continuous improvement. I'm not going to talk a lot about it today because that's the topic for tomorrow. But I think continuous improvement is so essentially important because I think if you take two teams that are otherwise completely different, if they both start doing continuous improvement well, they eventually will converge on many of the same agile practices. They will converge on automated testing. They will converge on peer review or other practices that improve quality and improve the software they're developing. Let's talk a little bit about how DevOps and Agile relate to each other. So Scrum, of course, is sort of the framework that most people think of immediately when they hear the term Agile. We have a lot of developers in the room, so that may not be 100% true for you, but if you talk to the average, say, business person and you say Agile, they're probably going to think of Scrum. And although Scrum has its roots in software development, it's not only for software development. In fact, when Scrum was developed, they intentionally left out a lot of the software development practices like pair programming and test-driven development. They left out all that stuff. Specifically to make it more general so that it could apply to other business processes and to make it easier to, I'm going to use the word sell, and I don't necessarily mean that in the financial sense, although it's definitely part of that. They made it, but to make it easier to sell to management. They didn't want the managers who might be choosing to do Scrum to get confused by all the technical jargon in software development practices. Second, you probably heard of Kanban. Kanban originates in the Japanese auto manufacturing industry. The way it's used in software development isn't exactly the same way it's used in manufacturing, but that's okay. In fact, it's quite much simpler. It's a lot simpler in software development. It usually just means a board of cards that move from left to right as they progress, and that's useful. It's different than the way it's used in manufacturing, but that's okay. And then extreme programming, as I mentioned a moment ago. But by the way, the picture you see there, some of you have probably seen it before. That is the background for the website for the the manifesto for Agile software development. If you go to that website and read the manifesto, this is the background image. So this is the group of people who signed that original manifesto. And in that group were many people from the Scrum background and many people from the extreme programming background. So these people were friends. They knew each other. They still know each other, of course. But it was an intentional decision on Scrum's part to leave that XP stuff out. DevOps is a great way to pick that back up and reintegrate it into a Scrum team. Lean also comes from the manufacturing industry. Basically, it's a methodology or a system for eliminating waste. And the term MVP, minimum viable product, comes from the Lean mindset, the Lean terminology. So these are all different Agile concepts that most of us have seen, and there are many, many others. And in my experience, most teams sort of pick and choose. They take a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and they kind of throw their own thing together, and I think that's great. I mean, I don't see a problem with that at all. I want to look at a typical org chart. Of course, there's no names on this chart. That doesn't matter. How does Scrum or what many people just call Agile fit into this chart? I would say it fits here. If green represents, say, middle management or product managers or something like that, and your yellow represents, say, software developers, maybe testers, front-end engineers, designers, UX designers, UI designers, whatever individual contributor role you might have, Scrum kind of manages that relationship between product and individual contributor. And as I mentioned earlier, it focuses, as far as the DevOps framework is concerned, it focuses on that planning stage. So what's missing from this chart? Maybe this area? Yeah. This isn't really what I want to talk about today. I mean, there are different frameworks for managing Agile at the C level, for example, or upper management. But that's not what I'm going to talk about. There are great courses about that, no doubt. I'm talking about something, it's a trick question or it's a trick situation because I didn't actually put it on the chart. I want to talk about something even below this level. So here below the org chart, you have all these different things: servers, different technologies, AWS, programming languages, Docker, best practices, all these different things practices and technologies that your team might use. And these are, you might think of these as ways to talk to the servers. If you want to call those pink boxes servers or mobile phones or pieces of technology. So in my view, DevOps handles this relationship. And this is not meant to be a strict definition. I mean, you could easily, I already said that DevOps handles planning, so you could extend this blue circle up to the green area as well. The point here is that DevOps fills a gap that Scrum and many other Agile practices simply doesn't cover, and that's intentional. It's not a problem with these mindsets or with these frameworks. It's an intentional limitation. So here again, the point I mentioned earlier, Scrum, when we look at this DevOps framework, Scrum really only handles the first segment of that, the planning. I am through my slide deck. Are there any questions I can answer for anybody? What is my goal? That's a great question. What is my goal by the end of this for you? My goal, I guess two goals. One, I would hope that you will have at least one, ideally more than one, specific tactic or strategy that you can take that you can apply to your daily work. Second, I'd like to pique your interest into research or looking into this topic in greater depth. The additional sessions will be much more in-depth, much more technical. This was just an overview. I kind of had to set a baseline so that we know where to start and that we know what we're talking about. If I start talking about continuous integration before I explain how it fits into the overall view of DevOps, then that's a little bit harder. So today's setting a groundwork, and then in the following sessions, I'm going to go into more detail. I hope that in each day from here on, you can grab at least one thing per day that you could apply to your daily work, and then have something that you want to look into later for additional. What are red flags in job ads about DevOps? What are positive signs? Oh, that's a good question. Well, the first thing is if it says DevOps engineer or DevOps team in the title, it's a red flag. It may not be a red flag that the job is bad, but maybe just the recruiter doesn't understand DevOps. That's very possible. The main things I would look for are, how does the DevOps team, and you may not get this, say, during a job, in a job posting, but during an interview, you could ask about these things. Ask, how does the DevOps team, misusing that word intentionally, how does the DevOps team interact with the developers? Is it a collaboration, or is it a throwing things over the fence party sort of thing? Now, there are different ways to approach this, and I can't get into too much detail in a course this length, but broadly speaking, there's two ways I see these teams go, and you could ask which, if either of these they use. One is that the devs and the ops literally work together. Like, a developer writes some code, talks to the operations team, and says, "Hey, I have this code. Can you help me deploy it?" The other is that the operations team maybe becomes sort of a platform team, and they produce a platform, maybe a Kubernetes platform or an AWS platform that the developers can consume. So the developers essentially, the basic point is that the developers should never have to hand over their work to another team. And you can do that in one of two ways. One is to have the teams work together so there's no handoff. And the other is that the operations team gives a platform that's sufficiently complete that the developer can deploy to production and do testing and monitoring without bugging the operations people. So I would ask questions along those lines in the interview. How do your developers deploy code? Do they create a zip file and then send it to somebody on an FTP server and hope that things go well? That's a bad sign. Or do they deploy things themselves through an API, through a web interface, something? Or do they work with somebody who helps them deploy it? So that's the main thing I would look for is there a wall between developers and operations? What can we look up on the topic of monitoring? That is a great question. I don't have a ready answer, but I'll tell you what, I will find an answer and send a couple recommended resources.